Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do, and we upload 3, 4, or even 5 times every week. Before we get started, please gently invite the like button to go on a relaxing, all-expenses-paid solo camping trip deep in the Alaskan wilderness, but right before you drop them off, replace their high-end thermal sleeping bag with a single, thin paper napkin. Now, let's get into today's story. The vast, frozen expanse of Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska is a place of breathtaking beauty, but it is also a place that demands respect. It is a landscape carved by ice, dominated by towering peaks, deep fjords, and dense, temperate rainforests. It is a place where nature is still the undisputed king, and humans are merely temporary guests. For 36-year-old Kevin, a nature lover and outdoor enthusiast from California, this rugged wilderness was the ultimate destination. Kevin was not your average weekend warrior who camped in his backyard. He was a man who took the outdoors seriously. He had spent years hiking the trails of the Sierra Nevada, he was in excellent physical shape, and perhaps most importantly, he was meticulously prepared. Kevin had spent months planning this specific trip. He had pored over topographic maps, studied the weather patterns of Southeast Alaska, and he had even completed an advanced survival training course specifically designed for cold weather isolation. He wanted to disconnect. He wanted to be alone with his thoughts and the raw power of the natural world. He planned to spend exactly 3 weeks alone in the wild, living off the supplies he carried and soaking in the solitude. When Kevin arrived at the ranger station to pick up his backcountry permit, he was the picture of confidence and competence. He spoke at length with the rangers, detailing his route, his gear list, and his emergency protocols. He had a satellite communication device, bear-proof canisters for his food, and layers of high-tech clothing designed to withstand temperatures well below freezing. The rangers, who were used to seeing unprepared tourists try to bite off more than they could chew, were impressed. They signed off on his permit without hesitation. Kevin told them exactly where he would be and established a strict timeline. He would be out for 3 weeks, and he would return to the pickup point on a specific Sunday afternoon. The drop-off went smoothly. A charter boat took Kevin deep into the park, navigating the icy waters until they reached a secluded shoreline that marked the start of his journey. As the boat engine faded into the distance, leaving Kevin standing alone on the rocky beach, a profound silence descended. This was exactly what he had wanted. For the next 2 weeks and 5 days, Kevin was truly alone. We do not know exactly what Kevin did during those weeks. We can assume, based on his personality, that he hiked, he photographed the glaciers, he journaled, and he set up a disciplined camp routine. But we do know that he never activated his emergency beacon, he never sent a distress signal. To the outside world, Kevin was having the trip of a lifetime. However, the mystery begins 2 days before Kevin was scheduled to be picked up. It was a Friday morning. A park ranger pilot was flying a routine patrol over the sector where Kevin was camping. It was standard procedure to keep an eye on solo campers, especially those deep in the backcountry. As the small plane banked over the valley where Kevin's coordinates were marked, the pilot looked down, expecting to see a neat, organized campsite. Kevin was known for his precision, so the pilot expected a taut tent and organized gear. But that is not what he saw. From the air, the campsite looked wrong. It looked chaotic. The bright orange fabric of the tent was not standing upright. It was collapsed, flattened against the rocky ground. Concerned, the pilot circled back for a lower pass. He saw no sign of Kevin, no movement, no smoke from a campfire, just the flattened tent and scattered equipment. The pilot immediately radioed base, reporting a potential distress situation. Within hours, a team of rangers arrived at the location by boat and hiked up to the campsite. The atmosphere on the ground was heavy. The silence of the woods felt oppressive. As they approached the camp, the feeling of wrongness intensified. The first thing they noticed was the tent. It had not just collapsed from the wind or snow, it had been moved. The tent stakes had been ripped from the frozen earth, and the entire structure had been dragged about 10 feet from its original flat clearing and then left to crumple onto uneven rocks. The poles were snapped, not from a storm, but as if something heavy had crushed them. The Rangers immediately began shouting Kevin's name, their voices echoing off the valley walls. "Kevin! Kevin! Can you hear us?" There was no answer, only the wind whistling through the hemlock trees. They began to process the scene, treating it as a potential crime scene or animal attack. In Glacier Bay, the biggest threat is typically the brown bear. A hungry bear can tear a tent to shreds in seconds if it smells food. But as the Rangers inspected the site, they found something that made absolutely no sense. Kevin's food supply was intact. His bear canisters, filled with high-calorie freeze-dried meals, energy bars, and jerky, were sitting right there in the open. They had not been clawed at, they had not been gnawed on, they were completely untouched. This was impossible. In this part of Alaska, the predator density is incredibly high. Bears, wolves, wolverines, they all have noses that can smell food from miles away. If a tent is abandoned for 2 days, the food should be gone. Scavengers should have picked the site clean, but nothing had touched it. It was as if the local wildlife was avoiding this specific spot. The Rangers checked the rest of the gear. Kevin's backpack was there, his sleeping bag was inside the collapsed tent, his water filtration system, his camera, his satellite beacon, it was all there. The beacon was turned off with full battery. He had never tried to use it. There was no blood. There were no signs of a struggle. The ground around the tent was hard and frozen, making tracking difficult, but there were no obvious drag marks or signs of a frantic fight for life. It was as if Kevin had just stepped out of his tent and vanished into thin air. The search began immediately. The Rangers called in backup. Helicopters with infrared cameras, search dogs, and ground teams swept the area. They gridded the valley, moving out in concentric circles from the campsite. For the first few hours, they found nothing. Then, late in the afternoon, a radio call crackled across the frequency. A team searching a dense, rocky area about half a mile away from the camp had found something. Hi there, welcome back to the channel. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. But before we get into today's story, if you could please offer to take the like button out for a nice, expensive candlelit dinner, but the moment the breadsticks arrive, just stand up, scream, "I never loved you," and vanish into the night without paying the bill. That would be great. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. Now, today's story is about a man who thought he was being hunted by something supernatural, only to realize that the most terrifying thing in the world was actually his own mind. All right, let's get into today's story. It was the afternoon of January 5th, 1909. In a small, quiet corner of rural Michigan, a 56-year-old minister named Thomas Whitmore kissed his wife and children goodbye. He stepped out of his cozy cottage, wrapped a heavy wool cloak over his black press suit to ward off the biting winter air, climbed onto his horse, and began the long trek toward a town 9 miles away called Columbus. Thomas was a man of high standing, a pillar of the community. He was headed to Columbus to lead a religious revival, a series of sermons meant to bring new souls into the fold. As he trotted down the snowy paths, he saw children playing, throwing snowballs, and building forts. Everyone knew the Reverend. He couldn't go 50 yards without someone waving him down for a chat. Being a man of God, Thomas played the part. He smiled, he nodded, and he made small talk, even though deep down he was in a hurry. He finally reached a stretch of the road where the houses thinned out and the woods took over. This was his favorite part of the journey, the quiet mile. It was a place where he could finally be alone with his thoughts and prepare his heart for the sermon ahead. But the silence didn't last. From behind him, the rhythmic thud of galloping hooves began to grow louder. Thomas turned in his saddle and saw a man approaching fast. The rider looked disheveled, his hair was slicked back with grease, and he wore a stained brown shirt under a tattered overcoat. Thomas recognized him immediately. His name was Silas Vance. Silas was the town's troubled soul. He had a reputation for erratic behavior and a very serious struggle with the bottle. To be blunt, he was the last person Thomas wanted to spend his quiet mile with, but Thomas felt a moral obligation to be kind. As Silas pulled up alongside him, he flashed a wide, toothy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, Reverend," Silas shouted over the wind. "Mind if I ride with you?" Thomas felt a pit form in his stomach. For weeks, it seemed like every time he turned a corner in town, Silas was there. It was becoming more than a coincidence, it was becoming haunting. But, trapped by his own politeness, Thomas nodded. "Of course, Silas, join me." Almost immediately, the interaction turned strange. Silas peppered the Reverend with invasive questions. He wanted to know exactly where Thomas was going, how many churches he oversaw, and how much money the ministry was bringing in. Thomas, feeling increasingly cornered, tried to give short answers, but Silas wouldn't let up. Then, Silas did something that fixed Thomas's attention. Without breaking his stride on the horse, Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a single silver coin. He began to flip it. Flip, catch. Flip, catch. Silas wasn't even looking at the coin. His eyes remained locked on the Reverend's face with that same eerie grin. But the Reverend couldn't look away. There was something about the sound, the metallic times, ring times as it spun through the freezing air, and the sharp times, slap times as it hit Silas's palm. In Thomas's mind, something began to shift. He wasn't just watching a man play with a coin anymore. He became convinced that the sound was a frequency, a tool. He felt a wave of relaxation wash over him that felt unnatural, almost like he was slipping into a trance. He stopped answering Silas's questions. He just watched the silver flash in the winter sun. In that moment, Thomas Whitmore, a man of education and faith, came to a terrifying conclusion. Silas Vance is a sorcerer. He is using this coin to put me under a spell. They eventually reached a crossroads where a small general store sat tucked into the tree line. Silas caught the coin, tucked it away, and told Thomas they needed to stop. Thomas wanted to scream no. He wanted to gallop away as fast as his horse could carry him. But in his mind, he believed the hypnosis was absolute. He felt as though his limbs were no longer his own. "I'm not going in," Silas said, leaning over his saddle. "You are. Go inside, buy me a new hatchet, and bring it back out to me." Thomas didn't argue. He felt like a passenger in his own body. He walked into the store, numbly reached into his own pocket, paid the clerk for a sharp, heavy-duty hatchet, and walked back out to the man he now believed was his master. He handed the weapon to Silas. Silas took it, tucked it into his belt, and said, "Now, let's go to that church of yours in the valley. I'm thinking of getting married, and I want to see the altar." Thomas knew Silas was already married. The lie was obvious. But under the weight of his own growing madness, Thomas simply turned his horse toward his own church. They reached the small, white-steepled church just as the sun was beginning to dip. Thomas unlocked the heavy oak doors, and the two men stepped into the freezing sanctuary. Thomas, acting out of habit, walked to the back and lit the wood-burning stove to take the chill off the room. When he walked back toward the center aisle, Silas was standing there, flipping that silver coin again. "Stop right there," Silas commanded. Thomas froze. He looked at Silas, his heart hammering against his ribs. Do you want to look around?" Thomas managed to whisper. Silas didn't look at the pews. He didn't look at the stained glass. He just kept flipping the coin. "No," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. "Raise your left arm, Reverend." Thomas's arm shot up. In his mind, it wasn't a choice. It was the magic of the coin. "Now the right one," Silas said. Thomas stood in the center of his own church, arms spread wide like he was being nailed to a cross. He was weeping now, terrified of what this wizard was going to do to him. But then, the unthinkable happened. Silas, perhaps distracted by his own games, fumbled. The silver coin slipped through his fingers, hit the wooden floorboards with a dull times clink, and rolled away into the shadows. In Thomas's fractured mind, the spell had just broken. He believed that for a split second, the sorcerer had lost his power, and Thomas knew he had to act before Silas could pick that coin back up. He didn't think, he didn't pray, he lunged. The next day, around noon, the church caretaker arrived to check on the building. He knew the Reverend was supposed to be in Columbus, so he was surprised to see a thick pillar of black smoke rising from the chimney. He approached the front door and found it unlocked. Pushing it open, he was met with a sight that would haunt him until the day he died. The church was a slaughterhouse. Blood was everywhere, sprayed across the white-painted pews, pooled on the altar, and smeared across the floor in a long, dark trail leading toward the stove. Scattered among the gore were shreds of a black suit, the very suit the Reverend had been wearing when he left home. The caretaker even found a specific ornamental button that he knew belonged to Thomas Whitmore. Heart in his throat, the caretaker followed the blood trail to the wood-burning stove. He opened the heavy iron door. Inside, resting amidst the glowing embers and ash, was a charred human skull. The news hit the town like a lightning bolt. The beloved Reverend had been murdered, and the town drunk, Silas Vance, was missing. A multi-state manhunt was launched immediately. The theory was simple. Silas had been in a rage after a fight with his brother-in-law, saw the Reverend on the road, and took his anger out on the man of God. But the police were looking for the wrong man. 3 days later, 500 miles away in a city in Illinois, a man walked into a local boarding house. He was skeletal, pale, and looked as though he were haunted by 1,000 ghosts. He wore a stained brown shirt and a long overcoat that was far too large for him. He told the landlady his name was John Elder. He paid for a room in cash and told her he would be fasting and did not wish to be disturbed. For a week, he stayed in that room. The landlady, worried about his health, left plates of food outside his door, but they were never touched. Finally, on the morning of January 12th, she heard a sound coming from the outhouse in the backyard, a low, wet moaning. She ran to the outhouse and hammered on the door. "Mr. Elder, are you all right?" The only response was a gargled sob. She threw the door open and screamed. The man was sitting there, his throat slashed from ear to ear. He had tried to end his own life, and he had succeeded. When the local authorities arrived to process the scene, they searched the man's pockets. They didn't find any identification for a John Elder. Instead, they found a blood-soaked letter addressed to the sheriff of the town in Michigan where the Reverend lived. The letter changed everything. It wasn't Silas Vance who had died in that outhouse. It was Reverend Thomas Whitmore. In the letter, Thomas detailed the entire spell he believed Silas had cast on him. He truly believed he had been fighting for his soul against a man with supernatural powers. He described how he had used the hatchet to break the curse, how he had forced Silas to strip so he could burn the man's identity in the stove, and how he had shredded his own clothes to make the world believe the Reverend was the victim. Thomas Whitmore had spent his final days wearing the blood-stained clothes of the man he murdered, hiding in a room 500 miles away, consumed by a psychosis that no one in 1909 understood. The skull in the stove didn't belong to the Reverend. It belonged to Silas Vance, a man whose only crime was being an annoying neighbor with a habit of flipping a coin. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do and we upload once a week. Now, before we get started, please invite the like button out for a romantic Valentine's Day dinner at a fancy restaurant. But right when the waiter brings the check, tell the like button you forgot your wallet in the car, sneak out the back door, and leave them to wash dishes for the next 6 hours to pay off the bill. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Today's story takes us back to the winter of 1971. It's a story about a young couple, a school dance, and a Valentine's Day tragedy that became one of North Carolina's most haunting cold cases. And stick around until the end, because I really want to know your thoughts in the comments section about the strange knots found at the crime scene. Do you think they were a clue the police missed, or just a distraction? Let's get into today's story. The winter of 1971 in North Carolina was a season of quiet chill, a time when the humid air of the South turned crisp and biting. In the burgeoning communities of Durham and Chapel Hill, life moved at a steady, predictable pace. It was a time before ubiquitous surveillance, before cell phones, and before the loss of a certain type of innocence that defined the era. For two young people, Jesse McBain and Patricia Mann, it was supposed to be the beginning of the rest of their lives. Instead, it became a dark legend that would haunt the region for more than 50 years. Jesse McBain was a handsome, athletic young man, 19 years of age. He was a student at North Carolina State University, known for his gentle demeanor and his love for sports. He had a steady, reliable nature that made him popular with his peers and beloved by his family. Patricia Mann, whom everyone called Pat, was 20 years old, a nursing student at Watts Hospital in Durham. She was described by those who knew her as responsible, bright, and incredibly kind. They were the picture-perfect couple. the kind of pair you would expect to see in a yearbook photo under the caption, "Most likely to succeed." They had been dating for roughly 3 years, a serious commitment for people so young. By all accounts, they were deeply in love. There was no turmoil, no secret lovers, and no involvement in the darker subcultures of drugs or crime that were beginning to seep into American society in the early 70s. They were simply two kids in love, looking forward to a Valentine's Day celebration. The date was Friday, February 12th, 1971. Although Valentine's Day was officially 2 days away, the festive spirit was already in full swing. Watts Hospital, where Pat was training to become a nurse, was hosting a Valentine's dance at the local armory. It was a formal affair, a chance for the nursing students to dress up and celebrate with their sweethearts. Jesse drove his car, a 1968 Chevrolet, to pick up Pat. The evening began with the typical excitement of youth. The music was loud, the room was decorated in red and pink streamers, and the atmosphere was one of joy. Witnesses would later recall seeing Jesse and Pat dancing, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. There was no tension, no arguments, and no sign that a predator was watching. The couple left the dance shortly after 11 o'clock at night. The plan was simple. Jesse would drive Pat back to her dormitory, and then he would head home. It was a routine they had performed dozens of times. They walked out into the cold February night, the air thick with the promise of frost. They got into Jesse's car and drove away from the lights of the armory. That was the last time anyone would see them alive. The first signs of trouble arose the following morning, Saturday, February 13th. Pat Mann was known for her strict adherence to rules. She had a curfew at her nursing dormitory, and she was not the type to break it. When her roommates woke up and realized Pat's bed had not been slept in, a ripple of unease began to spread. Simultaneously, the McBain family was realizing that Jesse had not returned home. It was completely out of character for him not to call or check in. By the afternoon, the unease had turned into panic. The parents of both students began calling one another, their voices trembling with a shared dread. They called the hospitals, they called the police. In 1971, law enforcement often took a relaxed approach to missing young adults. The initial reaction from the authorities was dismissive. They suggested that the couple had simply run off to get married, or perhaps they had decided to spend a romantic weekend away for Valentine's Day. Kids will be kids, was the sentiment. But the families knew better. Jesse and Pat were responsible. They had exams, jobs, and commitments. They would not just vanish without a word. Frustrated by the slow police response, the families and friends organized their own search parties. They drove the roads between Durham and Chapel Hill, scanning the ditches and the tree lines for any sign of Jesse's car. On Sunday, February 14th, Valentine's Day, the first piece of the puzzle was discovered. But it was not found by the police nor by the family. It was found by chance. Jesse's car was located parked on a quiet, unfinished cul-de-sac near a place called Lover's Lane, specifically on a road that led toward a new golf course development. The location was not far from where they had last been seen, but it was secluded enough to be private. When the authorities arrived at the vehicle, the scene was baffling. The car was locked tight. Inside, the couple's coats were neatly folded on the back seat. This detail sent a chill through the investigators. It was a freezing cold night. Why would they leave their coats behind? If they had gone for a walk, they would have taken them. If they had run away, they would have taken the car. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. No blood, no shattered glass, no disarray. It was as if they had simply evaporated. The keys were missing, the gas tank was full, the radio was silent. The car sat there like a tomb, offering no answers, only more terrifying questions. The discovery of the car escalated the situation from a missing persons case to a potential abduction. The police began to scour the surrounding woods, but the weather was working against them. A cold rain had fallen, matting down the leaves and washing away potential footprints. Days turned into weeks. The hope that Jesse and Pat were still alive began to fade, replaced by a grim resignation. The entire community was on edge. Parents told their children to come home before dark. Students at the university walked in groups. On February 25th, nearly 2 weeks after the couple disappeared, a surveyor was working in a dense patch of woods in Orange County, just over the county line from Durham. He was walking through a thicket of trees, an area so overgrown that it was difficult to navigate. As he pushed through the brush, he saw something that looked out of place. It looked like a mannequin, or perhaps a pile of discarded clothes. As he moved closer, the horrific reality came into focus. He had found Jesse McBain and Patricia Mann. The scene that awaited the police was the stuff of nightmares. The couple was found tied to a large tree, roughly 150 feet from the road. They were fully clothed, but their positions were grotesque and heartbreaking. They were covered in leaves and moss, suggesting the killer had made a crude attempt to camouflage the bodies. Both victims had their hands tied behind their backs. A single long rope was used to bind them, not just to the tree, but to each other. The rope was looped around their necks and their waists in a complex, rigid manner. It was a tableau of cruelty. The autopsy reports would later reveal the brutality of their final moments. Both Jesse and Pat had been strangled. The ropes around their necks were tight, agonizingly so, but the horror did not stop there. There were signs of torture. The medical examiner found stab wounds and evidence of beatings. It appeared they had been terrorized for some time before they finally succumbed to strangulation. One detail stood out to the investigators, a detail that would obsess detectives for decades: the knots. The rope used to bind the couple was not ordinary household twine. It was a thick, braided rope, the kind used for heavy lifting or perhaps maritime activities. But it was the way the knots were tied that puzzled the experts. The killer had used a series of intricate knots to secure the victims to the tree and to one another. These were not the clumsy knots of a panicked amateur. They were precise, they were practiced. Some of the knots were identified as square knots, while others were more complex variations. Interestingly, the analysis of the rope revealed that the knots were tied with a specific inconsistency. Some were tied in a way that suggested a right-handed person, while others suggested a left-handed person, or perhaps someone who was ambidextrous. Or, more chillingly, it suggested that the killer stood behind them and tied the knots by feel, reversing the usual orientation. The rope became the central piece of evidence. Detectives visited hardware stores, military surplus shops, and farms across 3 counties, trying to trace the origin of the cordage. They consulted with sailors, rock climbers, and even magicians, trying to find someone who recognized the specific style of binding. The binding style suggested control. The killer wanted them helpless, but also wanted them to witness the other's suffering. The psychological profile that began to emerge was one of a sadist, someone who derived pleasure not just from the killing, but from the dominance and the terror he inflicted. The investigation into the Valentine's Day murders was immediately plagued by a jurisdictional nightmare. The bodies were found in Orange County, but the couple had been abducted from Durham County. The car was found on the border. In the 1970s, communication between different police departments was often poor. There was no central database, no internet to share files instantly. The Orange County Sheriff's Department and the Durham Police Department argued over who had the lead. Valuable time was lost in bureaucratic wrangling. Evidence was moved back and forth. Reports were filed in different cabinets. Despite these hurdles, the police did develop suspects. One of the most prominent theories involved a man who came to be known as the Doctor. In the weeks following the murders, investigators received tips about a medical professional who had a history of strange behavior and alleged sexual deviance. The precision of the torture and the fact that the killer seemed to know exactly how long the victims could survive strangulation led some to believe the perpetrator had medical knowledge. However, no hard evidence ever linked this doctor to the crime scene, and he eventually faded from the suspect list. Another theory focused on the local angle. The location where the bodies were found was deep in the woods off a dirt path that few people knew existed. It wasn't a place a transient or a stranger would stumble upon. The killer had to know the terrain. He had to know that this specific patch of woods was isolated enough to commit such a heinous act without being heard. This led police to interview people who lived on the fringes of the woods, hunters, poachers, and recluses. One neighbor in particular drew the attention of law enforcement. He was a man with a reputation for violence and a fierce territoriality about the woods near his home. He had allegedly threatened people who trespassed on what he considered his land. But again, despite the suspicion, there was no smoking gun. No blood on his clothes, no rope in his barn that matched the murder weapon. Months turned into years. The posters featuring Jesse and Pat's smiling faces began to fade and peel from the telephone poles. The case went cold. The files gathered dust in the basement of the sheriff's office. For the families, the pain was a constant living thing. They never stopped asking questions. They never stopped pressuring the police. But as the 1970s gave way to the 80s and then the 90s, the hope of justice seemed to wither. The parents of Jesse and Pat grew old, carrying the heavy burden of unresolved grief. Some of them passed away without ever knowing who killed their children. The Valentine's Day murders became a local legend, a ghost story told to teenagers to warn them about parking in secluded spots. The humanity of Jesse and Pat, their dreams, their laughter, their love, was slowly overshadowed by the brutality of their deaths. In the early 2000s, a renewed interest in cold cases began to sweep through law enforcement, driven by advances in forensic science. A dedicated investigator with the Orange County Sheriff's Office, Captain Tim Horn, took a personal interest in the McBain and Mann case. Captain Horn had grown up in the area. He remembered the fear that gripped the community when he was a child. He decided that he would not let the case die. He pulled the dusty boxes from the archives. He re-interviewed witnesses who were now in their 60s and 70s. He went back to the woods. Horn realized that the key to solving the case might still lie in the physical evidence that had been preserved. He turned his attention back to the rope. In the years since 1971, DNA technology had advanced from science fiction to reality. Horn wondered if the killer had left microscopic traces of sweat or skin cells on the rope as he pulled the knots tight. It was a long shot. The rope had been soaked in rain, handled by ungloved police officers in the 70s, and stored in a non-climate-controlled room for decades. But it was the only shot they had. He sent the evidence to private labs that specialized in extracting DNA from difficult samples. They used a vacuum technique to pull genetic material from the deep fibers of the rope. The lab results brought a glimmer of hope. They managed to isolate a DNA profile. It was not a complete profile, but it was enough to rule out many people. It proved that the killer was male, and it provided a genetic marker that could be compared to suspects. Captain Horn used this new information to eliminate several long-standing suspects. The doctor was finally ruled out scientifically. However, the investigation took a compelling turn when Horn and his team began to focus on a new suspect, a man who had been mentioned in the original files but never fully vetted. This man had been a violent offender with a history of sexual assault. He lived in the area. Most chillingly, he worked in a profession that required the daily use of ropes and knots. Investigators discovered that this suspect, who was now deceased, had been working at a hospital near where Pat Mann was a student. He had the opportunity, he had the local knowledge. And now they had to see if he had the DNA match. Because the suspect was dead, police had to obtain DNA from his surviving relatives to perform a familial comparison. This process was legally and ethically complex, but they proceeded. The results were inconclusive. They could not say for sure it was him, but they could not rule him out either. The partial nature of the DNA from the rope made a 100% match impossible. During the reinvestigation, another chilling detail emerged. A woman came forward with a story she had kept secret for 40 years. She claimed that shortly after the murders, a man she knew had acted strangely. He had washed his car obsessively. He had burned clothes in a barrel in his backyard. When she had asked him about the missing couple, he had allegedly made a comment that implied he knew more than he should. He said something to the effect of, "They shouldn't have been out there." This man was the same suspect the DNA testing was targeting. Captain Horn dug deeper. He found that this suspect had a connection to the specific type of rope used. He found that the suspect had been known to patrol the area near the golf course. The pieces were fitting together. forming a picture of a predator who hunted couples in lovers' lanes, a man who hated the innocence he saw in others. But without a confession or a definitive DNA match, the district attorney could not bring charges against a dead man. The standard of proof required beyond a reasonable doubt, and 40 years of degradation to the evidence made that bar incredibly high. Captain Tim Horn eventually retired, but not before doing everything in his human power to solve the case. He handed the files over to the next generation of detectives, ensuring that the work he had done would not be lost. To this day, the murders of Jesse McBain and Patricia Mann remain officially unsolved. There has been no trial, no verdict, and no sentencing. The man believed to be the killer took his secrets to the grave. However, in the court of public opinion and in the eyes of the investigators who lived and breathed the case, the mystery is largely considered resolved. They believe they know who did it. They believe that a violent local man, familiar with the woods and skilled with ropes, saw an opportunity on that cold February night and destroyed two beautiful lives. The legacy of the case is a somber one. Every year when Valentine's Day approaches, the local newspapers in Durham and Chapel Hill run articles about Jesse and Pat. They publish the black and white photos of the couple. Jesse with his strong jaw and kind eyes, Pat with her bright smile and nursing cap. It serves as a reminder that behind the commercialization of the holiday, the chocolates, the cards, the roses there is the fragility of human life and love. The story of the Valentine's Day murders does not have a happy ending. It does not even have a neat ending. It ends with a question mark. But the story is also a testament to memory. For more than 50 years, the community refused to forget Jesse and Pat. Strangers who were not even born when the crimes occurred have dedicated thousands of hours to internet forums, discussing the evidence, analyzing the maps, and keeping the names of the victims alive. The tree where they were found has long since grown or fallen, the landscape of the woods changed by time and development. The cul-de-sac where the car was found is now a suburban neighborhood with paved driveways and manicured lawns. Yet, if you drive down those roads on a quiet, cold night in February, when the wind is stripping the last dead leaves from the oaks, it is hard not to feel the weight of history. It is the story of a stolen future. Jesse McBain and Patricia Mann should have been grandparents by now. They should have had careers, retirements, and golden anniversaries. Instead, they remain forever young, frozen in time in the winter of 1971. They are the eternal Valentines, bound together not just by the cruel ropes of a killer, but by the enduring memory of a community that continues to mourn them. The file remains open, the evidence remains in the locker. And somewhere, perhaps, the final piece of the puzzle is still waiting to be found, waiting for the day when the word unsolved can finally be erased from the record of the Valentine's Day missing couple. It is important in the retelling of such grim details to remember who Jesse and Pat were outside of their victimization. Patricia Mann was described by her nursing supervisors as having a healing touch. She was the student who stayed late to comfort frightened patients. She loved music and had a laugh that could fill a room. Jesse McBain was the protector of his younger siblings. He had a passion for fixing things, cars, radios, anything mechanical. He had a gentle strength that made people feel safe around him. They were not just names in a police file. They were vibrant, living souls. The tragedy is not just how they died, but the loss of the goodness they brought to the world. In remembering them, we acknowledge that while evil exists, the love they shared and the love their families held for them is the stronger, more enduring force. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place. We upload 3, 4, or even 5 times a week. So, if that is of interest to you, please invite the like button to a remote cabin deep in the Appalachian wilderness, offer them a warm cup of coffee by the fire, and then quietly step outside and remove the front porch steps so they can never leave. Now, let's get into today's story. The Appalachian mountain range is not just a collection of old rocks and trees. Geologically speaking, these mountains are among the oldest geological formations on the entire planet Earth. They were formed over 480 million years ago during the Ordovician period. To put that into perspective, these mountains were already ancient and weathered when the very first dinosaurs began to crawl across the prehistoric plains. They predate the Atlantic Ocean. They predate the rings of Saturn. Because they have existed for such an unimaginable vastness of time, there is a specific heavy energy in the air there. The locals, people whose families have lived in those hollows for 7 or 8 generations, often say that the mountains do not just sit there, they watch. They have seen civilizations rise and fall, and they have swallowed more secrets than any history book could ever hope to hold. In the heart of these mountains lies the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It is a place of incredible, breathtaking beauty, straddling the border between North Carolina and Tennessee. However, it is also a place characterized by a dense, impenetrable fog, the smoke, that gives the range its famous name. This fog is not like the light mist you might see in a coastal city. It is thick, heavy, and it can roll in within a matter of seconds, turning a bright, sunny afternoon into a gray, claustrophobic nightmare where you literally cannot see your own hands in front of your face. It is in this environment that people do not just get lost, they disappear. The statistics are unsettling. In the last 100 years, hundreds of individuals have vanished within the park boundaries without a trace, leaving behind no physical evidence, no clothing, and no remains. Our subject for this case is a man named Christopher. Now, it is important to establish early on that Christopher was not your average ill-prepared tourist who wandered off the pavement in flip-flops. He was 34 years old, in peak physical condition, and he had spent the last 10 years of his life hiking the most dangerous and isolated trails in North America. He was a systems analyst by trade, a profession that requires meticulous attention to detail, and he applied this same rigor to his hobby. He was the kind of person who obsessed over every single ounce of his gear. He did not just buy a standard backpack. He purchased the most expensive, ultra-lightweight carbon fiber frame pack available on the market, designed to distribute weight perfectly across the lumbar region. He did not just wear hiking shoes, he wore custom-fitted, waterproof mountaineering boots that cost over $500. He carried a high-end satellite GPS unit, a secondary magnetic compass, a professional-grade thermal emergency kit, and enough high-calorie rations to last a full week, even though he only planned to be out for 8 hours. Christopher believed that with the right technology and the right training, nature was something that could be managed and controlled. He was dead wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in June of the year 2024. The sun was just beginning to peek over the jagged, dark edges of the eastern peaks as Christopher pulled his slate gray SUV into a small, isolated gravel turnout near the trailhead of a path known locally as the Crow's Neck. This trail was not listed on any of the standard tourist maps you find at the visitor center. It was not marked with the cheerful painted blazes of the Appalachian Trail. It was a steep, grueling, and dangerous climb that led deep into the backcountry, miles away from the paved roads, the gift shops, and the cell phone towers. Christopher stepped out of his car and breathed in the cool, pine-scented morning air. According to the recovered data from his vehicle's computer system, he locked the doors at exactly 8:15 in the morning. He felt invincible. He checked his tactical watch, a device capable of monitoring barometric pressure and altitude. He tapped his GPS to calibrate the satellites, confirming he had a lock on 12 different orbital signals. He slung his heavy pack over his broad shoulders and began his ascent into the green cathedral of the forest. For the first 4 hours, the hike proceeded exactly as he had envisioned. The trail was narrow and challenging, winding through ancient, towering groves of hemlock and spruce trees. The terrain was rugged, filled with roots the size of pythons and rocks slick with morning dew. He was making incredible time, his legs feeling strong and rhythmic. By 11:30 in the morning, he had reached the 5-mile marker, an old gray wooden post that had been weathered by decades of mountain storms. This marker signified the halfway point of his ascent. He decided it was time for a short break. He sat down on a large mossy rock, opened a vacuum-sealed protein bar, and took out his phone to snap a photo of the sprawling valley below. In that photo, which would later be analyzed by forensic digital experts for hundreds of hours, Christopher is smiling a wide, confident smile. The valley behind him is a stunning sea of deep green, rolling hills fading into the blue horizon. But if you zoom in to the upper left-hand corner of the frame, right where the dense thicket of mountain rhododendrons meets the dark tree line, there is something that absolutely should not be there. It is a vertical, blurry shape, a pale, gray pillar that stands at least 8 feet tall. It is far too thin to be a tree and far too tall to be a normal human being. It appears to be leaning slightly forward from behind a trunk, as if it is peering around a branch, silently watching Christopher eat his lunch. Christopher, however, never saw it. He tucked his phone away and kept moving upward. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the mountain weather began to shift with a violent suddenness. This is common in the high Appalachians, but meteorologists who later reviewed the atmospheric data from that day noted that this particular shift felt unnatural. The barometric pressure plummeted. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of minutes, sending a shiver through Christopher's core. A thick, suffocating fog began to crawl up the mountainside like a giant living creature. Christopher reached a section of the mountain known by the locals as the dead zone. This is a high-altitude plateau where the wind is usually so fierce and the soil is so thin that almost nothing can grow. It is a desolate landscape of jagged gray rocks and stunted, twisted shrubs that look like grasping hands. As Christopher stepped onto the flat expanse of the plateau, he felt a sudden, sharp, and painful pressure in his inner ears, exactly like the sensation you get when a commercial airplane descends too quickly for your body to adjust. And then the sound vanished. In the deep woods, there is always some level of noise, the rustle of wind in the leaves, the hum of insects, the distant, lonely call of a bird. But on this plateau, at exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon, everything went bone-dry silent. It was as if a giant hand had reached down, flipped a cosmic switch, and muted the entire physical world. Christopher stopped dead in his tracks. The silence was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight on his chest. He could hear the frantic sound of his own blood rushing through his carotid artery. He could hear the wet click of his own eyes every time he blinked. It is a phenomenon sometimes referred to by paranormal researchers as the Oz factor, a complete isolation from the natural world. He pulled out his expensive GPS device. The screen was dead. It was not just out of battery. The liquid crystal display was swirling with strange, iridescent, oily colors, as if the internal computer components were being melted by a massive, invisible magnetic field. He reached for his manual magnetic compass, but the needle was not pointing north. Instead, it was spinning in frantic, endless, wobbling circles, unable to find magnetic north. And then, cutting through that unnatural silence, came the whistle. It was 2 distinct melodic notes, F sharp and D. It was clear, rhythmic, and terrifyingly human in its tone. It sounded like it was coming from a patch of dense fog just 20 yards to his left. "Hello?" Christopher called out. His voice sounded flat and dead, as if the thick fog was physically absorbing the sound waves before they could even leave his lips. "Is there someone there?" "I am an experienced hiker. Do you need medical help?" No one answered him. But exactly 3 seconds later, the whistle happened again. This time, it was unmistakably closer. It was now coming from his immediate right. Then, a third whistle, the same 2 notes, came from directly behind him, only a few feet away. Christopher did not wait for a 4th whistle. Every primal survival instinct in his DNA screamed at him to run. He turned around to head back down the trail he had spent all morning climbing, but the trail was simply gone. The fog had become a solid wall of white, so dense that he could no longer see the gray rocks at his own feet. He He felt a wave of intense, nauseating vertigo. He began to sprint in the direction he thought led back to his car, but within seconds, the environment around him changed. He was no longer on a rocky, high-altitude plateau. He was suddenly standing in a forest of massive black-bark trees that he did not recognize. These were trees that, botanically speaking, should not exist anywhere in the state of North Carolina. When Christopher did not call his wife Sarah by 6 o'clock that evening, as he had promised, she felt a small knot of worry form in her stomach. By 9 o'clock, that worry had turned into pure, cold-blooded panic. She knew her husband was a professional who prided himself on punctuality. She called the sheriff's department, and by 12 o'clock midnight, a full-scale emergency command center had been established at the Crow's Neck trailhead. The search for Christopher was one of the largest and most expensive operations in the history of the National Park Service. Because he was so well equipped with survival gear, the authorities initially assumed he was still alive and simply hunkered down somewhere to wait out the weather. They deployed 30 specialized search and rescue teams, 4 elite bloodhounds from the state prison system, and 2 military-grade helicopters equipped with FLIR forward-looking infrared cameras that can detect a human being's body heat from miles away, even through thick canopy. On the second day of the search, the bloodhounds picked up a faint scent near the 5-mile marker. They followed it with excitement up to the very edge of the dead zone plateau. But when the dogs reached the lightning-scarred oak tree, where Christopher had likely taken his final steps in our reality, they did something the veteran handlers had never seen in their entire careers. The dogs stopped dead in their tracks. They began to howl and whimper in a way that sounded almost like human screaming. One of the dogs, a brave bloodhound named Blue, actually turned and bit his handler's hand in a desperate, terrified attempt to run back down the mountain. They refused to go a single inch further onto the plateau. It was as if there was an invisible line in the dirt that their animal instincts told them was the edge of the world. For 21 long days, the entire country watched the news coverage. Volunteers scoured the woods. They found Christopher's discarded protein bar wrapper near the mossy rock. They found a single deep footprint in a patch of soft mud that looked as if he had been sprinting with incredible force. But after that footprint, there was absolutely nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed moss, no clothing fibers, and 0 heat signatures on the infrared cameras. It was as if Christopher had reached that specific spot on the mountain and had simply been deleted from the physical dimensions of our universe. On day 22, the sheriff sat down with Sarah in a quiet tent and spoke the words that no spouse ever wants to hear. They were officially transitioning from a rescue mission to a recovery mission. They were no longer looking for a man, they were looking for a body. At the exact same time the sheriff was delivering that devastating news to Sarah, 2 park rangers were performing a routine patrol along a restricted riverbank in a national forest in the state of Virginia. They were over 104 miles away from the spot where Christopher had disappeared in North Carolina. As the rangers rounded a sharp bend in the river, they saw something bright blue sitting on a large, flat, gray boulder. It was a high-end hiking backpack. Sitting perfectly still on a stone next to the pack was a man. The rangers approached with caution, thinking it might be a local vagrant or a trespasser, but as they got closer, their confusion grew. The man was wearing professional mountaineering gear that looked like it had just come off the shelf of a retail store. "Sir," one of the rangers called out, his hand resting near his radio. The man turned his head slowly. It was Christopher. But he did not look like a man who had been fighting for survival in the wilderness for 3 weeks. He did not have a single scratch on his face. His expensive clothes were perfectly clean. There was no mud, no dust, no sweat stains, and no tears in the fabric. He was perfectly clean-shaven, as if he had stood in front of a bathroom mirror with a razor only an hour ago. Most disturbingly, his $500 boots were spotless. There was not even a speck of dirt in the deep treads of the soles. The rangers, who had seen Christopher's face on the news every night for 3 weeks, were in a state of total shock. Christopher, is that actually you?" Christopher looked at them with a deeply confused and slightly annoyed expression. Yes? Is there something wrong, officers? Am I accidentally in a restricted area? I did not see a sign. Christopher, you have been missing for 22 days. The whole country has been looking for you. Your wife thinks you are dead. Christopher let out a short, nervous laugh. 22 days? What are you talking about? I left my SUV at 8:15 this morning. I have only been hiking for about 6 or 7 hours total. It is about 2:30 in the afternoon right now. He looked down at his tactical watch. The digital screen was frozen in time. It did not show the date or the day of the week. It just showed 4 blinking digits. 2222. The aftermath of Christopher's return was even more terrifying than the disappearance itself. He was immediately flown to a top-tier medical research facility in Washington, D.C., where he underwent every biological and psychological test known to science. The doctors were looking for signs of starvation, dehydration, exposure, or trauma. The results were not just strange, they were scientifically impossible. His body showed 0 signs of environmental or physiological stress. His hydration levels and electrolyte balance were those of a healthy man who had just finished a glass of water. His stomach contents were analyzed, and they found the partially digested remains of the exact protein bar he had eaten at 11:30 on the day he vanished. According to biological decomposition rates, that bar should have passed through his system 21 days ago. But in Christopher's body, it was as if only 3 hours had passed. The most chilling piece of evidence came from his damaged GPS device. When forensic technicians finally managed to bypass the fried circuitry and extract the raw data, they found only 2 recorded data points in the memory bank. Data point 1 recorded his location at the 5-mile marker in the Great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon on the day he vanished. Data point 2 recorded his location at the riverbank in Virginia at exactly 2:22 in the afternoon on that same afternoon. The physical distance between those 2 points was 104.6 miles. To travel that distance in exactly 7 minutes, Christopher would have had to move at a sustained speed of over 890 miles per hour. That is faster than the speed of sound. Furthermore, he would have had to travel in a perfectly straight line, passing through solid granite mountain walls and over massive inland lakes without ever touching the ground. If a human body were subjected to that kind of acceleration and velocity, the G-force alone would have liquefied his internal organs. Yet, Christopher stood there without so much as a bruise. Christopher never regained a single second of memory from those 3 missing weeks. To his mind, those 22 days simply did not exist. He remembers stepping into the thick fog on the plateau, hearing that 2-note whistle, and then feeling a brief, sickening sensation of falling upward like the drop on a roller coaster. Then he remembers stepping out of a patch of mist and seeing the river in Virginia, thinking he had just taken a wrong turn on the trail. Today, Christopher lives in a small, sun-drenched town in the middle of the Arizona desert. He has completely abandoned his former life. He sold all of his hiking gear. He refuses to go near a forest. He refuses to look at a mountain. He told a private investigator that sometimes when the desert wind dies down and it is very quiet at night, he can still hear those 2 notes, F sharp and D, being whistled softly right outside his bedroom window. He knows now that he did not just walk 100 miles. He was taken somewhere else, somewhere ancient, somewhere that does not follow the human rules of time, space, or physics. And the most terrifying part of his story is not that he was taken. It is the realization that whatever took him might still be out there, whistling in the dark, waiting for him to come back to the trees. The case of Christopher remains one of the most baffling cold cases in the files of the National Park Service, despite the fact that the victim survived. It serves as a grim reminder that while we have mapped the surface of the moon and explored the deepest trenches of the ocean, there are still pockets of our own world that we do not understand, places where the map ends and the nightmare begins. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do, and we upload 3, 4, or even 5 times every week. Before we get started, please invite the like button over to your house to watch the Super Bowl. Tell them you have a 60-inch flat-screen television with surround sound, but when they arrive, make them watch the game on a battery-operated pocket television from 1995 while sitting on a damp milk crate in the garage. Now, let's get into today's story. The American West is a landscape that defines the concept of scale. If you have ever driven through the state of Montana, you know exactly what I mean. It is called Big Sky Country for a reason. The horizon seems to stretch on forever, dwarfing anything human-made. In the northern part of this state lies one of the most spectacular yet unforgiving wilderness areas on the planet, Glacier National Park. It is over 1 million acres of jagged peaks, pristine alpine lakes, and thick, shadowy forests that look exactly the same today as they did 10,000 years ago. It is a place of immense beauty, but it is also a place where the food chain is very much alive and humans are not always at the top of it. For Patrick, a man in his late 40s, Glacier National Park was not just a tourist destination, it was a sanctuary. Patrick was the kind of guy who, perhaps like many of you listening, had spent his youth chasing adrenaline, but as he matured, he developed a deeper, more reverent appreciation for the wild. He was not a reckless kid taking selfies on cliff edges. He was a seasoned, experienced hiker. He knew how to read a topographic map, he knew how to layer his clothing to prevent hypothermia, and he knew how to handle encounters with wildlife. He was the type of person who double-checked his gear and had a backup plan for his backup plan. It was late autumn when Patrick decided to take a solo trip to the park. This is a time of year that locals know can be treacherous. The golden larch trees are beautiful, but the weather can turn from sunny to a blizzard in the blink of an eye. Most of the tourists have gone home, the concessions are closed, and the park begins to feel empty, quiet, and incredibly vast. Patrick was driving his vehicle along one of the remote access roads on the outskirts of the park boundaries. It was late at night. The moon was obscured by heavy cloud cover, making the road ahead a tunnel of darkness illuminated only by his headlights. He was likely tired, perhaps thinking about his route for the next day, or maybe just enjoying the solitude of the drive. Suddenly, a massive shape lunged from the tree line. It was a deer, perhaps a large buck, darting across the asphalt. Patrick slammed on the brakes, but there was no time. The impact was sickening. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass shattered the silence of the forest. His vehicle skidded, tires screaming against the pavement before coming to a violent halt on the shoulder of the road. Patrick sat there for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs, the smell of coolant and burnt rubber filling the cabin. He was shaken, but he was alive. He stepped out of the vehicle to assess the damage. The front end was destroyed, the radiator was crushed, hissing steam into the cold night air. The vehicle was not going anywhere. This is the moment where everything changed. We do not know exactly what went through Patrick's mind in those minutes. We know he was miles from the nearest town, there was no cell phone service, a common reality in this part of Montana. He had 2 choices: stay with the car and wait for a passing vehicle, which might not come until the next day given the season and the remote road, or gather his gear and hike. Patrick was a hiker. He was prepared for the woods. He likely looked at his crippled vehicle, then looked at the dark forest and made a calculation. He knew the terrain. He knew there were established trails nearby. Perhaps he thought he could hike to a ranger station, or perhaps he simply decided to camp for the night in the woods rather than sleep in a cold, broken car on the side of the road. He opened his trunk. He took out his backpack, which was fully loaded for a multi-day trek. He took his tent, his sleeping bag, his food supply, and his navigation tools. He locked the car, leaving it as a metal tomb on the roadside, and he stepped off the pavement and into the trees. That was the last time anyone ever saw Patrick alive. When Patrick failed to check in with his family and employer, the alarm was raised. It did not take long for authorities to find his car. It was exactly where he had left it, the front end smashed, the deer carcass nearby. It was a clear accident scene, but Patrick was gone. The search that followed was extensive. Search and rescue teams, canine units, and helicopters scoured the area. They fanned out from the car, checking every trail, every drainage, and every ridge. But the weather in Glacier National Park is a cruel adversary. As the search began, the winter storms rolled in. Heavy snow began to fall, blanketing the landscape in white, burying any footprints, masking any scent the dogs might have picked up, and hiding any clue that Patrick might have left behind. The search had to be suspended. The risk to the searchers was too high, and the likelihood of finding a man alive in those conditions plummeted with every passing hour. Winter descended with its full fury, sealing the park in ice and silence. For 6 long, agonizing months, Patrick's family waited. They waited through Thanksgiving, through Christmas, and through the thaw of spring. They knew the odds were impossible, but the lack of closure is a specific kind of torture. There was no body to bury, no story to explain the end. Just a car on the side of the road and a man who walked into the dark. Then came the spring. As the snow melted and the sun began to warm the earth, the park rangers began their annual task of clearing the backcountry trails. It was deep in the season, 6 months after the crash, when a pair of rangers were patrolling a remote, heavily wooded section of the wilderness miles away from where Patrick's car had been found. They were moving through a dense stand of pine trees when they saw something that did not belong. The forest floor in this area is a carpet of brown needles and ferns, usually broken only by fallen logs or boulders. But there, in a small natural clearing, was a splash of synthetic color. The rangers approached cautiously. It was a tent. But it was not a tent that had been set up recently. The fabric was faded by the sun and battered by the wind. It had collapsed, the poles likely buckling under the weight of the winter snows that had come and gone. It lay flat against the ground, looking like a discarded wrapper. The rangers knew immediately that they had found something significant. They radioed in their position and began to document the scene. What they found as they lifted the heavy, weather-beaten fabric of the tent turned this from a tragedy into a baffling mystery. Usually, when a tent is abandoned in the wild for 6 months, nature reclaims it. Bears, wolverines, mice, and pine martens will tear into it. They smell the food, the toothpaste, or even the salts and the sweat on the sleeping bag. They rip the fabric to shreds, but Patrick's tent was intact. Aside from the structural collapse caused by the snow load, the fabric was not torn. There were no claw marks, there were no bite marks. The rangers carefully opened the tent. Inside, they found a time capsule of that night 6 months ago. Patrick's sleeping bag was rolled out, ready for sleep. His backpack was there, and, most shockingly, his food supply was there. High-calorie energy bars, freeze-dried meals, items that emit strong odors that should have attracted every predator within 10 miles, were sitting there, untouched. For 6 months, through a brutal winter where animals are desperate for calories, nothing had touched this stash. It was as if the local wildlife had made a conscious decision to avoid this specific spot. The rangers began to inventory the gear, looking for a journal, a note, anything that would explain what happened. They found his water bottle. They found his flashlight. They found his first aid kit. But then they found the item that sent a chill down their spines. Lying on the floor of the tent near the entrance was a leather knife sheath. Patrick was a serious outdoorsman. He carried a high-quality, fixed-blade survival knife. It was the kind of tool that is essential for survival, used for cutting wood, preparing food, and, in a worst-case scenario, for defense. The sheath was empty. The snap that holds the handle in place was undone. The rangers searched the tent frantically. They lifted the sleeping bag, shook out the clothes, and checked every pocket of the backpack. The knife was nowhere to be found. They expanded their search to the immediate area outside the tent. They looked for the knife in the grass, thinking perhaps he dropped it. They looked for signs of a struggle. They looked for blood. They found nothing. There was no blood inside the tent. There was no blood outside the tent. There were no shredded clothes suggesting a fight. There were no shell casings. The scene painted a terrifyingly specific picture. Try to put yourself in Patrick's situation that night. He has just survived a car crash. He is pumped, full of adrenaline. He hikes into the woods, miles away from the road, seeking the safety of a campsite. He finds this clearing. He sets up his tent in the dark, perhaps using a headlamp. He rolls out his sleeping bag. He is exhausted. He prepares to sleep, but he does not sleep. At some point in the darkness, something happens. If he had been attacked by a bear while he was sleeping, the tent would be destroyed. There would be blood, the food would be gone. If he had gone out to use the bathroom, he would likely have left his gear and maybe taken a flashlight, but why would he take his large survival knife and unsnap the sheath? And if he succumbed to the cold while outside, his body would be nearby. The empty sheath suggests intent. The prevailing theory, and the one that keeps veteran rangers awake at night, is that Patrick heard something. Imagine lying in that tent, miles from civilization, in the pitch black. The wind is howling through the trees, and then, over the sound of the wind, you hear a noise, a branch snapping, a heavy footfall, a guttural breathing sound right outside the thin nylon wall of your tent. Patrick was experienced. He knew the difference between a squirrel and a predator. He knew that if a bear is sniffing your tent, you make noise, you bear spray, or you prepare to fight. He did not grab his food to throw it away. He did not grab his backpack to flee. He reached for his knife. He unsnapped the leather strap, a sound that is distinct and loud in the silence of the woods. Pop, he drew the blade. And then he made the decision to go outside. Why? You do not leave the safety of your tent to fight a bear with a knife unless you have absolutely no choice. You do not go outside to investigate a noise unless you are compelled to do so. Patrick unzipped the tent door. He crawled out into the cold, dark night, weapon in hand, ready to confront whatever was out there. And whatever was out there took him. But it took him without a fight that left a mark on the ground. It took him without spilling a drop of blood near the tent. It took him silently, and it took him completely. The Rangers searched the area around the tent for weeks after the snow melted. They looked for bones, for scraps of clothing, for the knife itself. They found absolutely nothing. Patrick had walked out of his tent, armed and alert, and simply ceased to exist. There are those who suggest he might have had a medical episode, became confused, and wandered off. But the paradoxical undressing associated with hypothermia usually results in people shedding their clothes, not arming themselves with a knife. And if he wandered off to die of exposure, his body should have been found within a reasonable radius. Others suggest a mountain lion. A cougar is a stealth predator. It can ambush a human, but a cougar attack is violent and messy. It does not pluck a grown man from his campsite and vanish without disturbing the tent stakes. And then there is the silence of the predators. The fact that the food was untouched remains the most baffling piece of physical evidence. In the wild, calories are currency. For a campsite laden with food to sit unmolested for 6 months suggests that the local animals sensed something about that location or something about what happened there that kept them away. It is a detail that defies biological imperatives. The story of Patrick serves as a haunting reminder of the thin veil between safety and the unknown. He was not a novice. He did everything right. He had the gear, the skills, and the mindset. He survived a 60-mile-per-hour collision with a deer. He successfully navigated the backcountry at night. He set up a perfect camp. But in the end, it was not the cold or the crash or a fall that claimed him. It was a noise in the dark. To this day, hikers in that section of Glacier National Park report an eerie feeling when passing through certain dense sections of the forest. They talk about the silence, how the birds seem to stop singing all at once. They talk about the feeling of being watched from the tree line. Patrick's family eventually held a memorial service without a body. They mourned the man who loved the mountains, the man who found peace in the solitude of the high country. But somewhere deep in the Montana wilderness, under the canopy of ancient pines, there is a rust-covered knife lying under the brush, dropped by a hand that was pulled into the darkness. And until that knife is found, or until Patrick is found, the question remains, what did he hear that made him unzip that tent? And why did he never come back? If you enjoyed this story, please be sure to check out our other